Good morning, everybody, or I guess afternoon. I guess it depends on when you're watching this. I thought I would read to you from To Kill a Mockingbird, chapter 17. We are at the trial. You might have remembered that everybody seemed to be coming into town to see what was going on and to witness the trial of Tom Robinson. Many people are not happy that Atticus is doing this, but he feels that it is his job as a prosecutor to defend people and defend Tom, even if he's not going to succeed in getting him released. He still feels that it is important that he does it. And so the courtroom is packed. There was nowhere for the kids to sit. They're sitting up in the balcony in the Negro section. And they're fine with this. They don't really think anything of it. They're not even really supposed to be there, so it's kind of a good place to hide out. And we are going to begin the trial. And I'm starting on page 222. "Jim," I said, "are those a Ewell sitting down yonder?" "Hush," said Jim. "Mr. Heck Tate's testifying." Mr. Tate had dressed for the occasion. He wore an ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his high boots and lumber jacket and bullet-studded belt. From that moment, he ceased to terrify me. He was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hand clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. The solicitor, Mr. Gilmer, was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville. We saw him only when court convened, and that rarely, for court was of no special interest to Jem and me. A balding, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Although his back was to us, we knew he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which he used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person, which he was actually doing nothing of the kind, and thus he was hell on juries and witnesses. The jury, thinking themselves under close scrutiny, paid attention, and so did the witnesses, thinking likewise. "In your words, Mr. Tate," Mr. Gilmore was saying. "Well," said Mr. Tate, touching his glasses and speaking to his knees, "I was called—" "Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you. Who called you?" Mr. Tate said, "I was fetched by Mr. Bob Ewell yonder one night." "What night, sir?" And Mr. Tate said, "It was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Ewell came in. Very excited he was, and said, 'Get out to his house quick, that some black raped his girl.'" "Did you go?" "Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could." "And what did you find?" "I found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room, one on the right. You know, you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner and said she was all right. I asked who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson." Judge Taylor, who had been concentrating on his fingernails, looked up as if he were expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. "Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Tom Robinson's house, and I brought him back. She testified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there is to it." "Thank you," said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, "Any questions, Atticus?" "Yes," said my father. He was sitting behind his table. His chair was skewed to one side, his legs were crossed, and one arm was resting on the back of his chair. "Did you call a doctor, Sheriff? Did anyone call a doctor?" said Atticus. "No, sir," said Mr. Tate. "Didn't call a doctor." "No, sir," repeated Mr. Tate. "Well, why not?" There was an edge to Atticus's voice. "Well, I can't tell you why I didn't. Wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty beat up. Something sure happened, it was obvious." "But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anybody send for one, fetch one, carry her to one?" "No, sir," Judge Taylor broke in. He's answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor. Atticus said, I just want to make sure, Judge. And the judge smiled. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was trying to be dramatic. Adele was watching peacefully, and so was Mr. Reverend Sachs beside him. What is it? I whispered, and I got terse. Shh! Sheriff, Atticus was saying, you say that she was mighty banged up. In what way? Well, just describe her injuries, Heck. Well, she was beaten around the head. There was already bruising coming on her arms, and it happened about 30 minutes before. Well, how do you know? Mr. Tate grinned. Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming. Well, which eye? Mr. Tate blinked, and he ran his hands through his hair. Let's see, he said softly. Then he looked at Atticus as if he considered the question childish. Can't you remember? Atticus asked. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him, and he said, her left. Wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were? And Mr. Tate said, oh, yes. Yes, that's right. Her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. And then he turned his head and he looked around at Tom Robinson. As if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said. No. Atticus walked to the court reporter's desk and bent down to the furiously scribbling hand. It stopped, flipped back the shorthand pad, and the court reporter said, Mr. Finch, I remember now, she was bunged up on that side of her face. Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. What side again, Hick? The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about them? Atticus seemed to be bordering on another question, but he thought better of it. He said, yes. What were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson, as if to say this was something they hadn't bargained for. Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck, and there were definite finger marks on her gullet. All around her neck? At the back of the neck? I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch. Oh, you would? Yes, sir. She had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with. Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff, said Atticus dryly, and Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and he nodded to the court solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. Below us, heads turned and feet scraped the floor, babies were shifted to the shoulders, and a few children scampered out of the courtroom. The Negroes behind us whispered softly among themselves. Dill was asking Reverend Sachs what it was all about, but Reverend Sachs said he didn't know. So far, things were utterly dull. Nobody had thundered. There were no arguments between opposing counsel. There was no drama. A grave disappointment to all present, it seemed. Atticus was proceeding amiably, as if he were involved in a little dispute. With his infinite capacity for calming turbulent seas, he could make a rape case as dry as a sermon. Gone was the terror in my mind of stale whiskey and barnyard smells, of sleepy sullen men, a husky voice calling in the night, Miss Finch, they gone? Our nightmare had gone with the daylight, and everything would come out all right. All the spectators were relaxed as Judge Taylor, except for Jim. His mouth was twisted in a purposeful half grin, and his eyes happy about it. He said something about corroborating evidence, which made me sure he was just showing off. Robert E. Lee Ewell. An answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. And when he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin and pointed and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It just seemed all to be part of his creepy neck. "So help me God," he crowed. Every town the size of Tkam had families like the Ewell. No economic fluctuations changed their status. People like the Ewells lived as a guest of the county in prosperity as well as in the depths of a depression. No truant officer could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health officer could free them from congenital defects, various worms, and the diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. Maycom's Ewells lived behind the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat, so only its general shape suggested its original design. Square, with 4 tiny rooms opening into a shotgun hall, and the cabin rested uneasily upon 4 irregular lumps of limestone. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summertime were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the various varmints that feasted on Maycom's refuse. The varmints had a lead time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough gleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs and broomsticks and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammered heads, snaggle-toothed rake heads, shovels, axes, grubbing hoes, held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remnants of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars, under which scrawny orange chickens pecked away. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycom. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars, holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson, had Miss Maudie deigned to permit a geranium on her premises. People said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9, and there were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. Nobody had occasion to pass by, except at Christmas, when the church delivered baskets, and when the mayor of Maycomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own tree and trash. Atticus took us with him last Christmas when he complied with the mayor's request. A dirt road ran from the highway past the dump down to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond the Ewells. It was necessary either to back out to the highway or go the full length of the road and turn around. Most people turned around in the Negroes' front yards. In the frosty December dusk, their cabins looked neat and snug, with pale blue smoke rising from the chimney and doorways glowing amber from the fires inside. There were delicious smells about, chicken and bacon frying crisp as the twilight air. Jem and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit, aromas that vanished when we rode back past the Ewell residence. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbors was that, if scrubbed with lye soap in very hot water, his skin was white. "Mr. Robert Ewell," said Mr. Gilmore. "It's my name, Captain," said the witness. Mr. Gilmore's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I've heard that lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in court, in the heat of argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemies of their parents, and they suffer agony and are surprised to see them often go out arm in arm with their torments during the first recess. Well, that was not true of Jem and me. We acquired no traumas from watching our father win or lose. I'm sorry that I can't provide any drama in this respect. If I did, it would not be true. He could tell, however, when debate became acrimonious, then professional, but this was from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except to a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmore was doing his job, as Atticus was doing his. Besides, Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmore's witness, and he had no business being rude to him of all people. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" was the next question. "Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead," was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in the swivel chair, and he looked benignly at the witness. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" he asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of good will. "This is the first time that you've ever been in court. I don't recall ever seeing you here." All the witnesses a firm nod continued. "Well, let's get something straight. There'll be no more audible obscene speculation on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand?" Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and he said, "All right, Mr. Gilmer." "Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you tell us in your own words what happened on the evening of November 21st, please?" Jim grinned. He pushed his hair back. "Just in your own words" was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid the witness might employ. "Well, night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling. Just as I got to the fence, I heard Mayella screaming like a stuck pig inside the house." Here Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness, and must have decided his speculation devoid of evil intent, for he subsided sleepily. "And what time was it, Mr. Ewell?" "Just 'fore sundown." "Well, I was saying, Mayella was screaming fit to beat Jesus." Another glance from the bench silenced Mr. Ewell. "Yes, she was screaming," said Mr. Gilmore. Mr. Ewell looked confused at the judge. "Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and I run as fast as I could, but I run to the fence. But when I got to tangled, I run to the window and I seen—" And Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and he pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. "I seen him yonder rutting on my Mayella." So serene was Mr. Judge's court that he had few occasions to use his gavel, but he hammered fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench saying something to him. Mr. Heck Tape, as his first officer of the county, stood in the middle aisle, quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. Reverend Sachs leaned across Dill and me and pulled at Jim's elbow. "Miss Jim," he said, "you better take Miss Jean Louise home, Mr. Jim. You hear me?" Jim turned his head. "Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home." "Well, you gotta make me first," I said. Remember Atticus's blessed dictum. Jim scowled furiously at me and then said to Reverend Sachs, "I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand it." I was mortally offended. "I most certainly do. I can understand anything you can." "Oh, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet." Reverend Sachs' black eyes were anxious. "Mr. Finch, no, you all hear? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or your boys either." Jim shook his head. "He can't see us this far away. It's all right, Reverend." I knew Jim would win, because I knew nothing would make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while, and Atticus could see us from where he was if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell was sitting smugly on the witness chair, surveying his handiwork. With one phrase he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd, being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps, lessening intensity until the only sound in the courtroom was the dim pink, 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 and the judge, he might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing, and I thought about what Atticus had said. He and Mrs. Taylor didn't kiss much. He must have been nearly 70. "There's been a request," Judge Taylor said, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators, or at least of women and children, a request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for, and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you one thing: you will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom, but you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. And Mr. Ewell, you'll keep your testimony within the confines of Christian usage, if that is possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilman. Mr. Ewell reminded me of a deaf mute. Well, I was sure he'd never heard the words Judge Taylor directed at him. His mouth struggled silently with them, but their import registered on his face. Smugness faded from it, replaced by a dogged earnest that fooled Judge Taylor not at all. As long as Mr. Ewell was on the stand, the judge kept his eyes on him, as if daring him to make a false move. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again. His fist rested on his cheek, and we could not see his face. Mr. Gilmore looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yeah, I did. The spectators were quiet, but the defendant said something. Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. You say that you were at the window? Asked Mr. Gilmore. Yes, sir. And how far is it from the ground? About 3 feet. And did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. Then how did the room look? Well, it was all slung about like there was a fight. And what did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the front door just ahead of me. I sawed who he was all right, and I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor squalling, and then what did you do? Well, I run for Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was all right. Lived down yonder in that nest past the houses every day. Judge, I've asked this kind of for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder, and they're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. Just a minute, said Atticus genially. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell backed up into the witness chair, settled himself, and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion, an expression common in Macomb County witnesses when confronted by opposing counsel. Mr. Ewell, Atticus said, folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see, you say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran outside, and you ran to Mayella, and you ran to Mr. Tate. Did you, during all of this running, run for a doctor? Wasn't no need. I seen what happened. But there's one thing I don't understand, said Atticus. Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition? I most positively was, said Mr. Ewell. I seen who done it. No, I mean her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention? What? Didn't you think that she should have had a doctor immediately? The witness said he never thought of it. He'd never called a doctor to anything of his in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. That's all? He asked. Not quite, said Atticus casually. Mr. Ewell, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you? How's that? Well, you were in the courtroom when Mr. Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you? Mr. Ewell considered the matter carefully and seemed to decide that the question was safe. Yeah, he said. Do you agree with this description of Mayella's injuries? How's that? Atticus looked around at Mr. Gilmer and smiled. Mr. Ewell seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. Mr. Tate testified that her eye was blackened, and that she was beaten around the— "Oh, yeah," said the witness. "I hold with everything Tate said." "You do?" asked Atticus mildly. "I just want to make sure." He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for 3 minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it were stock market quotations. "Which eye? Her left eye. Oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Fincher. I remember now, she was bunged up." He flipped the page. "Up on that side of the face. Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said." "Thank you, burnt," said Atticus. "So you heard it again, Mr. Ewell. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff?" "I holds with Tate. Her eye was black and she was mighty beat up." The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus an easy match. He seemed to grow ruddy with it. His chest swelled, and once more he was a little red rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. "Mr. Ewell, can you read and write?" Mr. Gilmore interrupted. "Objection," he said. "I can't see what witness literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial." Judge Taylor was about to speak, but Atticus said, "Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see." "All right, let's see," said Judge Taylor. "But make sure that we see, Atticus." Overruled. Mr. Gilmore seemed as curious as the rest of us as to what bearing the state of Mr. Ewell's education had on the case. "I'll repeat my question," said Atticus. "You can read and write?" "I most positively can." "Will you write your name and show us?" "I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks?" Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he'd gone frog-sticking without a light. Never on cross-examination ask a witness a question you don't already know the answer to. That was a tenet I absorbed with my baby food. Do it, and you'll often get an answer you don't want, an answer that might wreck your case. Atticus was reaching into the inside of his coat pocket. He drew out an envelope, and then he reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely and turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen and placed it gently on his table, and he shook the pen a little, and then he handed it with the envelope to the witness. "Would you write your name for us?" he asked. "Clearly now, so the jury can see it." Mr. Ewell wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on witness stand, and to see Mr. Gilmore half sitting, half standing at his table. The jury was watching him, and one man was leaning forward with his hands over the rail. "What's so interesting?" he said. "You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell," said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what being left-handed had to do with it, and that he was a Christ-fearing man, and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Tricking lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of him all the time with their tricking ways. And he told him what happened. He said it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story, and that if he looked through the window, then that black ran off and then ran after the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmore asked him one more question. "About your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell?" "I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other, he said, glaring at the defense table. Well, Jim seemed to have a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony railing softly, and once he whispered, "We've got him." I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Ewell could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was blackened, and she was mostly beaten on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Well, Sherlock Holmes and Jim Finch would agree, but Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Tate, I imagined a person facing me, and went through a swift mental pantomime and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked down at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulder and his bull-thick neck. He could easily have done it. I thought Jim was counting his chickens. So, make sure you remember that. She was beaten on the left side of her face, which means whoever had done it would have had to hit her with their right hand to get that, especially if it was palm there. And Mr. Ewell is left-handed. We heard a lot about the Ewells and where they live. They live down by where the blacks live, but they aren't exactly of that caliber. And so I think that that's also important to remember. So when we come back, we're going to do chapter 18. We're going to get through this trial and hear all different kinds of things, and then we'll talk about it. So don't forget to do your quizzes.